chess friends, I hope you are all doing well. Today, I'm excited to share with you a game from the Champions Chess Tour between Magnus Carlsen and Lazovic Denis. Denis is a chess prodigy and a genius boy who achieved Grandmaster title in his early 17 age. In another game I will show you a wonderful game between Iragasi Arjun and Magnus which was played yesterday. Arjun is an Indian chess player and a young prodigy. Both games are super aggressive and highly effective, so let's get started without wasting any time. Magnus started the game with d4, and we have knight to f6, e4 and e6 from black. Here, he wants to push his pawn to d5, he can also play the pawn to c5, knight to c6, or bishop out to b4, which is called the Rogozin defense. From white's perspective, he can play knight to f3, which will meet up with the pawn to b6 and bishop to b7, so here, Magnus played knight to f3, and after we have d5 in the game, Magnus followed with the g3 move, which is called anti-Nimzo-Indian. He wants to develop his bishop on the g2 square. Many of you might wonder that he just sacrificed this c4 pawn, but it can be regained by the queen by playing queen to a4 check. Additionally, you can play knight to d2 and involve your rook on the c1 square to activate the d square. Moreover, if you dare to capture the pawn on c4, it will lose control over the e4 square. That's why my knight can get into that square along with the bishop on g2, which can control that centered square. After bishop e7, and after both sides played castle, here Denis captured the pawn on c4. At this point, Magnus didn't play queen c2 or usual looking moves like knight to d2, instead, he played a wonderful move that also shocked me, pawn to h4. It is, according to me, an inaccurate move, but it has the potential to involve your rook on e1 and push your pawn on e4 to gain control over the center. By pushing the pawn, you create a pawn chain on the king side. Playing knight to d2 would allow you to attack the pawn on c4 and bring out your bishop to the f4 square to control this diagonal. Additionally, you can play queen to c2 followed by knight g5, bishop e4, combining forces to launch a heavy attack along with the king side after eliminating the f6 knight. This is the potential idea behind Magnus Carlsen's h4 move, which is why Denis replied with pawn to c5. After the exchange of captures, we have queen to c2 and knight to d7. You can see that Magnus didn't capture the pawn on c4 because it would allow black to develop one piece by playing queen to e7. This is why, after knight to c3, you can see that Magnus wants to bring out his bishop and move his rook to the d1 file, so after queen c7, bishop f4 followed by e5 occurred again. He played e5 to open up the diagonal of the light square bishop and simultaneously held a strategy to activate the knight on d7. Magnus moves back his bishop to d2, and Denis plays h6. He wants to prevent any pieces from accessing the g5 square. You can see that my bishop has the potential idea of moving to e4 to challenge the king side after eliminating the knight on f6 by playing knight to e4. However, Magnus chooses a different approach by playing pawn to a4. As the strategy no longer involves development, after knight to e4 and subsequent captures in the game, the pawn is under attack by the queen. And your pawn on e5 is also threatened by two pieces. Rook to c1 can increase pressure against the c4 pawn, and along that file and bishop diagonal. Denis, a young chess grandmaster and a very brilliant student, played rook to b8 to develop and adapt, intending to push his pawn on b5. Magnus shuts down his idea by playing pawn to a5, making b5 no longer possible due to an in-person move. Simultaneously, it protects the b6 square from any piece's entry. Despite this, Denis isn't afraid, as he defeated Magnus Carlsen long ago and believes he can do so again. Therefore, he aggressively plays pawn to b5, intending to develop the bishop on b7. After captures and bishop c3 occur in the game, the e5 pawn is under attack. However, Denis remains fearless and logical, playing bishop to b7 to attack the queen. After the queen moves, he will get the opportunity to push the pawn to the e4 square. After the queen moves, black played e4 and sacrificed the knight on the d7 square to capture Magnus Carlsen's knight on the f3 square. Magnus appeared frustrated as he hadn't played any brilliant moves or made sacrifices in the game. He decided to play queen to g4 in an attempt to checkmate black instantly. And let me tell you an inspiring quote. Focus only on what you can control, let the other aspects of life play out without your wasted energy. So Dennis responded with queen to g6, proving he's no less than Magnus Carlsen. He's Magnus Carlsen's young protege. After a few sequences of captures and queen exchanges on the g4 square, Dennis could have played rook to b6 to protect the pawn. Magnus was one pawn up against black's three-pawn structure in the kingside. However, Magnus Carlsen is an endgame master who can defeat even a strong grandmaster with just one pawn advantage, even if he has a 0.1 advantage in the endgame. After bishop b4 and subsequent captures, rook to b3 was played to attack the pawn. A couple of moves later, he played rook to e4 to attack the pawn on the f2 square. Playing rook to b2 would have increased the attack, but Magnus ignored that and played rook to c6, aiming to attack the pawn on c4. Consequently, the c3 pawn would become a passed pawn. After rook b2 and rook f1, Magnus played to protect that pawn. Some of you might be tempted to play rook to e4 in order to protect that pawn. However, that move will be met with king to f3, which will attack the rook. So, after the rook moves to c2 and checks, Magnus picks up the pawn on c4. A few moves later, we have rook to a1 and rook to a4 in the game. By playing rook to c7, Magnus still had the pawn on the g4 square, but it's still a draw against this three-pawn structure on the kingside. After Magnus initiated with rook to e4 and rook to a5, and after a couple of moves later, after a couple of rook dances later, Dennis stationed his rook on the d7 square to protect his 7th rank, so, none of the white rooks can come on the 7th rank to create a potential attack on the kingside. That is Dennis's strategy. After rook to b4 and rook to e2, and after a couple of moves later, we have rook to b5, and Magnus, in frustration, logically played pawn to g5, accomplishing a pawn exchange on the g5 square. This pawn is under attack, which is why you cannot capture the pawn, as I can easily capture that pawn and get two connected passed pawns. After rook e7, and after captures occurred in the game, rook f4 and rook to g4 check followed. The king moved back to f7 and here comes rook to h5 followed by rook to h7. The king moved there and rook to f4 contains a very nice strategy. It attacks the pawn on f6, and by playing rook to h6, it will increase the pressure against the pawn. Here, Dennis should play rook to d2 to connect the rooks, so that after rook e4, king f5 can come and attack the rook, leading to a draw. However, Dennis had very little time, which is why he played rook to a2, a big blunder due to having only 13 seconds left. At this point, rook a2 is a complete blunder, as Magnus follows up with pawn to g4, pushing his king to g3, and planning to push his pawn to f3 and rook to f5, completely busting the position. Alternatively, rook to h5 was also a strong move. After a few moves, we have rook a4, and Magnus plays rook to a6 check. The king cannot go there, nor should it go to e5 because of rook check on e7, leading to Magnus picking up the rook on the e3 square. In the endgame, having only one rook cannot stand against two connected passed pawns in this position. After rook d6, rook d3 and rook to f3, we have rook exchanges on e5 square by pushing the pawns. After a few moves, Magnus sacrifices one pawn by playing g5 to get a passed pawn. Magnus is completely winning the game, picking up the pawn on the g5 square, and advancing his king to the f6 square. This position is completely winning for him, with rook to e8 coming and black just losing. Dennis loses the game, and Magnus takes revenge against him, because Dennis defeated Magnus Carlsen 6 months ago. That's a great feat for Magnus, and that concludes the first game. Let's move on to the next game, which was played between Erigaisi Arjun and Magnus Carlsen. This game took place yesterday and was part of the Champions Chess Tournament. Arjun began the game with d4. By the way, this game was particularly dramatic and adventurous for Magnus. Magnus responded with d5, and he chose not to play pawn to c4, which is known as the Queen's Gambit. He could have considered this option as well, given that he could play knight to f3, followed by knight to c6. From this perspective, White has two major options: playing bishop to b4, initiating the Rogozin defense, or bishop to e7, both moves are possible. After bishop to f4, white gains control over the diagonal, and the rook can come into the c1 square to utilize the open file. The center becomes intense, pressured by knights and pawns. However, the game could have unfolded differently. In our actual game, Arjun didn't play pawn to c4, instead, he opted for knight to f3, following knight to f6 and bishop to f4. Magnus responded with a copycat variation. Arjun then played bishop to d3, still not opting for pawn to c4. Here, white could have played knight to d2, which has the potential to push the pawn to the c4 square with the knight and bishop attack. By reinforcing the knight on f1, white can maneuver the knight to the g3 square to attack the bishop. At this point, white contains a power strategic plan. For instance, if you play normally, like bishop to e7, then I can even join the knight on e5, which is viable. Whether knight to e7 or knight to c6 are major options for black. h5 is also playable. Some might be tempted to play castling, which seems natural and logical. However, this move could lead to a downfall position. I can strike hard by playing pawn to g4, attacking the bishop. This pawn is well protected by the queen and knight. After you play bishop to e4, attacking the rook, I'll use the f3 move to kick out the bishop again. Then, pawn to h4 will come, attacking the bishop by pushing it to the h5 square. At this point, you can see that your kingside and pieces are vulnerable and have become weak. So, after h6 to protect the d square, playing h6 will leave your bishop on g6 weakened, making it easy for me to capture it on the g6 square. After you capture, I can play bishop to d3, attacking the pawn on the g6 square, as none of your pieces can protect that pawn. Even moving the king to h7 will create a vulnerable situation for you because I can move my pawn up to the h5 square. Additionally, I can push my pawn to the g5 square. I'm creating a destructive situation for you, which will bring a decisive advantage for me. The rook file will be open, and moving my queen to e2 and h2 will create a vulnerable situation around the kingside. Going back to the position, even Erigaisi Arjun didn't play knight to d2, despite having a strong strategy behind that move. He just played bishop to d3. I think he wants to make this game a draw by exchanging all the pieces. According to me, this is just an absurd looking move. After the bishop moves back and castling happens in the game, Magnus himself had the choice to play pawn to c5, but he didn't. Instead, he played bishop to d6, wanting to exchange pieces and make the game a draw. What a coincidence. After knight to e5 and knight to h5 happened in the game to attack the bishop, and after that, the bishop indirectly attacks the f4 pawn on the board. After capture and recapture in the game, they even captured the dark square bishop. This makes the h2 pawn a potential attack for black in the long run. Here, white finally decided to move his pawn to c4 and ultimately moved his knight to the c3 square. After a few moves, he played pawn to g3, which protects the knight's entry point on the f4 square. Additionally, you can reinforce your bishop by playing bishop to f1, followed by bishop g2 to activate it on this diagonal. At this point, after moving the knight back and capturing the pawn on the c4 square, Magnus ultimately played a short side castle. Here, Arjun played pawn to e4, acting like a great warrior, wanting to push his pawn to the e5 square. At this time, some might be tempted to push the pawn to e5 to prevent white's attack, but it's not the right approach. White can easily push forward his pawn to d5, creating a decisive advantage. Returning to the question, black didn't just push the pawn, he played rook to d8, a wonderful and intriguing move. Magnus sacrificed one piece, giving white the opportunity to push the pawn forward to the e5 square. Did Magnus really sacrifice the knight due to a blunder, or does it have a very good strategy? He played this move because he had a great strategy by moving his queen to the b4 square, simultaneously attacking the bishop. If they capture the knight on the f6 square, I can even capture your piece back on the c4 square, and you can gain the pawn on the g7 square for free. I can even move my rook to the knight on the f6 square, and you can see that you have vulnerabilities around your kingside. The rook is attacking the pawn on the d4 square, and simultaneously the queen puts pressure on the a2 square, which is why if you move your knight back, I can easily capture that pawn. Returning to the position, at this juncture, Magnus played rook to d8, and we see that pawn to e5 is not a big threat. After the bishop moves back, Magnus himself played pawn to e5, and after capture happened. Arjun made a big committed move by pushing his pawn to f4. It is a very committing and insane move, as it can lead to both an aggressive position for white because Arjun is a talented guy. He knows that happiness derived from a combination of the senses, and the sense objects is always a cause of distress and should be avoided by all means. This is a powerful quotation by Gita. So Arjun committed to his pawn chain on the king side, and you can see that e5 may come in the future. He has a very good open diagonal for the bishop, and the knight is not very activated due to the c6 pawn protecting that square. The knight has to reinforce itself by maneuvering to e2 to get that potential outpost, or he can even push the pawn to e5 to get the square on e4 for the knight to activate on d6 as a knight outpost. That's the strategy. After the queen goes to e7 and f3 square, black immediately played knight to c5 to attack the bishop. Some might be tempted to play bishop to c2 to protect the e4 pawn, but then knight to e6 will come to get the d4 outpost for the knight. Some might consider playing rook to d1, but that move is ineffective as black can still play knight to d4, attacking the queen. Regardless of your queen move, another knight can immediately join the party on the g4 square. Both knights are creating a vulnerable situation around the king side and the center because Arjun's pawns are too committed. If you dare to play queen to g2, knight to e3 will attack both pieces. Even if you play queen back to e1, another knight on the f3 square will fork the king and queen simultaneously, ending the game. Returning to the position, we see that bishop c2 would create a vulnerable situation around the king side and center, which is why Arjun decided to move his pawn to e5, attacking the knight. However, Magnus simply captured the bishop, and now he's considering playing knight to d2 to attack both pieces. At this juncture, some might be tempted to capture the knight on the f6 square instead of capturing the b3 knight, as it would attack the queen on the e7 square. However, doing so would create a potential weakness for you. After you capture, I can easily take the pawn on the f6 square. I can even check you by playing queen to c5, forcing you to block the check by playing queen to f2. Then, the rook on d2 square will come into play, making a powerful and astonishing move. The rook creates a vulnerable situation in the second rank, which is damaging and destructive for you. Black will get advantages, so going back to the position. At this point, Arjun decided to capture the knight on b3. Magnus could have gone with knight to d5, but instead, knight to e4 appeared, potentially moving to d6 and creating a weak and destructible situation for black. This led black to move back his knight to e8, a waiting move to consider further maneuvers. He intends to maneuver his knight by playing knight to c7, followed by knight to d5 or knight to e6. After rook to d1 and rook exchanges, the rook appeared on d8. Later on, we saw knight d4, knight e4 and rook exchanges on the d1 square. Then, the pawn on f6 attacked the pawn, preventing white from placing his knight on d6. After the queen moved to d6 and a series of moves with the king and knight, queen checked on c4, followed by the knight moving to c5 to reach e6. Instead of moving back his knight to d3 to protect the pawn, Arjun went for a risky move by playing e6. This move commits the pawn too much and is quite risky. Some might consider playing queen to e7, which seems natural and innocent, but it would face knight to d7 check, forcing the king to move. Then, knight e5 would come, attacking the c6 and g6 pawns simultaneously, damaging black's position and making the game favorable for white. At this critical moment, we observed that the queen couldn't move to any seemingly natural squares, as they all posed risks. Even the f6 square was off limits due to knight to d7's threat. Thus, Magnus opted for queen to f5, and it seemed logical for black to play knight to d7. However, white's best move was actually to retreat the knight to d3. A decision reflected in the game after king to e7 and knight to f4 occurred. At this point, white should have considered knight to b4, attacking the pawn on c6. However, Arjun made a significant mistake by playing knight to f4 to protect the pawn with two pieces, likely due to time constraints, as he had only 4 seconds left. This error gave Magnus the opportunity to play pawn to g5, forcing the knight out of the game. Subsequently, Arjun made another mistake with queen to b4 check, a weak and ineffective move. This move left the pawn on e6 vulnerable, and the knight on a4 was under threat. After knight to d6 and knight back to d3, Magnus captured the pawn on e6. The game continued with c4 a5 and knight back to e1, the king was left exposed, and the knight's passivity became evident. Black delivered a check, and white's double pawns on the b file proved disadvantageous, leading to a loss. The game saw moves like knight f3, knight h4 followed by knight g6, and queen to e8. Eventually, queen exchanges took place after queen to e6. It marks the beginning of the endgame, where both sides have one knights each. However, black has the advantage with 3 connected pawns against white's double pawns, which puts black in a winning position. Magnus is known for his mastery in endgames. Following some knight and king maneuvers, c4 and captures occurred, leading to king to e4 and knight exchanges. Magnus captured a pawn, promoting his pawn to a new queen on the board side, although there was a check on h8. Magnus had another pawn on g5 with great potential to secure the win. A series of checks ensued, with Magnus protecting the pawn and preparing for promotion by maneuvering his king. Eventually, the pawn had a clear path to promotion, leading to a series of checks and Arjun's attempt to counter. However, Arjun made a critical blunder with queen to e2, and Magnus capitalized with king to a6, with the impending pawn promotion. Black was poised to win as queen e6 was not an option due to queen to g6 pinning down the king. This scenario left Magnus with an extra queen, securing his victory. It was an incredible and astonishing game by Magnus Carlsen, showcasing his skill and strategic prowess. I hope you enjoyed watching the game as much as I did. Wishing you all the best, goodbye, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel.